took you for a celebrity. And I know what you're all thinking, but no, it was not Brad Pitt. It was, next slide, it was Joel Osteen, which, I don't know, depending on your preferences, that might be good, might be bad. I did point out to the guy, I said, I don't have a mullet. But he said, no, a striking resemblance. I thought you were him for just a minute. So I got back to my office, ate my lunch, and called and made a haircut appointment the following day. But unfortunately, you don't have Joel Osteen, who's at least a very good speaker. You got me today, but I'll try to muddle through and see what we can do. Next slide. I'm going to talk to you about influence, the psychology of influence. This book on the screen, I've got it here if you want to take a look afterwards. It's the psychology of persuasion. I read that just a few months ago. It is very interesting. It's really from a perspective in business and how we're influenced by marketing pitches. I don't know if you've ever ended up buying something or signing up for something, and right afterwards you thought, what in the world was I thinking? Shortly before Krista and I were married, I bought a timeshare, which quickly I realized this is a terrible investment. I'm never going to use it. It was way too much money. We were on vacation a couple of years after we'd gotten married in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico, and we got invited to this timeshare presentation where they were going to give us some free stuff and a free meal. And we thought, well, let's go. Let's get the free stuff. There's no way we're going to buy a timeshare. We already made that mistake. And then 6 hours later, we were looking at ourselves saying, why in the world did we buy another timeshare? We were duped. And replaying in my mind what had happened, it still didn't make sense that we had fallen for this pitch. But this book really helps explain it, the weapons of influence that are used against us in marketing and business, but in other things too. And so this morning what I'm going to talk about is what they are, the key weapons of influence, particularly focused on one, how we can avoid it, and then how we can use it to expand the kingdom and serve God. So next slide. You may be asking yourself, why is there a turkey on the screen? I did choose this one because it's close to Thanksgiving. But to illustrate how our brains are hardwired, the author used the example of a turkey mother. Turkey mothers are very caring of their young. They hold them under their wings. They nurture them. But all of their mothering seems to be tied to the cheep, cheep noise that their babies make. And if a baby makes, I'm going to try to find a spot where I'm not. This is a good spot right here. If the baby makes a cheep, cheep noise, the mother takes it under its wing and cares for it. If it doesn't make the cheep, cheep noise, it's going to be shunned and maybe even killed. So they did an experiment with turkey mothers. And what they did was they took a stuffed polecat, which is the natural enemy of a turkey. And what they would do to illustrate the normal response that a turkey mother would have when a polecat approaches, they tied it to a string and they would pull it toward the turkey mother, who would squawk and flap its wings and peck at it in just a vicious attack. Well, then what they did, the same stuffed polecat, they put a recorder inside of it that made a cheep, cheep noise like a baby turkey. And when they did it, the mother took it under its wing and cared for it like a little baby turkey. Even though it looked the same, it smelled the same, everything else was the same, but that automatic response to the cheep, cheep noise that a baby turkey makes, and then as soon as they stopped the recording, took it back out, the mother went back to viciously attacking the polecat. And you would think, oh, just small-brained turkeys, of course they're going to be stupid and do things like that. But unfortunately, we are vulnerable to the very same things. Our brains are hardwired to have an automatic response to certain triggers. And so today I'm going to talk about some of what those triggers are. Turns out that's the same reason that I ended up with a second timeshare, because I have the brain the size of a turkey, apparently. So the first one, next slide, is reciprocation. This is simple enough, it makes sense. When you do a favor for somebody, if you give them a gift, they're likely going to do something back for you. But the reason isn't necessarily the reason we think of. There was a study at Cornell University where subjects who volunteered for the study, they found themselves rating pieces of art. They thought that they were supposed to rate pieces of art for quality and different aspects. And there were 2 subjects in the room. Well, it turned out one of the subjects was really the professor's assistant. It wasn't a real art appreciation. What they were trying to do was test this idea of reciprocation. So during a break, the assistant would go out of the room, he'd come back in, and with half of the subjects, he would say, oh, while I was out, I asked if it was okay if I got a Coke, and he said it was okay, so I brought you one too. He brought him a Coke. For the other half, he came back empty-handed, and they just went about their art appreciation rating. Toward the end of the study, after they rated all the pieces of art, and the professor leaves the room, the assistant, who again, the other guy still thinks is just a subject, says, you know, could you help me out? I'm selling raffle tickets for a car, and if I sell the most raffle tickets, I get a $50 gift certificate. And the people he gave a Coke to bought twice as many raffle tickets as the people he didn't give the Coke to, which isn't necessarily surprising, but they also had the subjects rate whether they liked the guy that they called Joe, liked Joe or not. And it turned out that even the people that disliked Joe, that didn't make a difference. If he bought them a Coke, they were buying just as many raffle tickets as the people who liked him. Their obligation, that automatic trigger response of their brain, was the same whether they liked him or not. They felt obligated, if he brought them, at the time, a 25-cent Coke, to buy a whole bunch of raffle tickets, more than the cost of a Coke. It doesn't make sense, but that's the way our brains are wired sometimes. That's the way the timeshare works, too. Now, we got $200 for going to this thing. We thought, they're the dupes giving us $200 for nothing, and of course then they got thousands of dollars from us. But next slide. Another weapon of influence is commitment, consistency. They use this against us on the timeshare too. They said, I know you say you don't want to buy this, but we're going to put this envelope down in front of you, and we want you to write down 3 things you like about this deal. Again, you're not doing it. We understand you're saying no, but just write down 3 things you like about the deal. Just the act of writing them down, now I know I'm never going to do that again. Based on this book, you want to be consistent with what you wrote down. You can't deny that you think those things about the deal are good. You just wrote them down. You're on record. And so your brain is naturally hardwired to be consistent with what statements you've made and what you've done. Another one, and the reason I've got these Christmas gifts up there, this one may make you mad now that we're in the Christmas season. Have you ever noticed how toy manufacturers always seem to run out of the hot new toy every year? You think, well, why didn't they plan better? They should have just made more toys. Well, it turns out, according to this guy's study, that they do it on purpose. The reason they do it on purpose, and that doesn't make sense, they'd make more money, just make more toys. Well, when little Johnny or little Sally tells Mommy or Daddy or Santa that I want whatever the hot new toy is, Mommy and Daddy say, yep, you're going to get it. And then we go to the store and they're not there on the shelves. What do? We ask the clerk, well, when are you going to have them? Probably not till after Christmas, maybe January or February. Well, what are you going to do? Are you just not going to get a present for little Johnny or little Sally? Of course not. You're going to get a different toy. And then, because you've already made the commitment that, yeah, you can have the hot new toy, come January or February, you're going to buy that one too, and so now you bought 2 toys instead of just one. So the toy manufacturers are using a weapon of influence, this commitment, because they know we're not going to just skip Christmas. And that one I don't have any advice for you. You're just going to end up buying 2 toys. So sorry. No good news there, no encouraging words. We're just going to fall prey to it every year. The next weapon of influence, this one makes sense. It's liking. We're influenced by people we like. That's why the best salespeople are likable people. They're people. They like to be around people. They interviewed a guy that was, I think he was out of Texas. He was known as the greatest car salesman in the world, based on his record. And they said, well, what's your secret? What's the secret to your success? Of course, he didn't want to tell him until he was retired. But he said, all it is I offer them a fair price and offer them the chance to buy from somebody they like. Like, well, how do you get them to like you? Like, well, the main thing I do, every month of every year, I send all of my customers, more than 13,000 people that he had done business with, I send them a note, and all it says on the note is, I like you, and it has my name, and that's all it says. But people hear, I like you, and they're like, well, you know, I like him too, he's all right. It feels good for people to tell you, I like you. So that's just a subtle way to influence people, get them to like you. The next one, weapon of influence, is authority. This one can be with actual authority, people with power, or just apparent authority. For example, study in the book talks about people that wear a suit and tie are thought of as being more authoritative. People respond more, even if they don't care whether you wear a tie consciously. If you're wearing a tie subconsciously in these studies where they rate how powerful someone seems or how authoritative, if you're wearing a suit and tie, they're going to rate you higher. So dress the part. For example, if you wear say a tweed coat and a bow tie, people may think you know what you're talking about because you look like a college professor. But the obligation to authority is so strong, and the reason I've got train tracks on the screen, there's a story of a man named Brian Wilson who lived in California in September 1st, 1987. He was protesting a shipment from the U.S. of military equipment to Nicaragua. And Mr. Wilson and two other men stretched their bodies across railroad tracks leading out of Concord, California at the Naval Weapons Station to block this shipment. Now, the protesters had notified the Navy and the railroad officials of their planned protest 3 days in advance. And so they were confident that their protest would be successful. But the civilian crew of the train had been given specific orders, don't stop for the protest. And so the civilian crew followed orders. They didn't even slow the train down and ran right over the guys. They didn't die, but had their legs cut off. But they were so distressed because they could see what they were doing. They didn't want to do it, but they had to follow orders because of the influence of authority. That they were so distressed that the train crew sued Mr. Wilson for causing them emotional distress, humiliation, mental anguish, and physical stress. They suffered this because he had not allowed them to carry out their orders without cutting off his legs. I don't know how the case turned out. I assume they lost. But it shows that they were so torn, well, we had no choice but to follow authority. And so we had to cut his legs off. All right, the next weapon of influence is scarcity. This makes sense too. When something is, we think it's going to go away, or we've got competition for scarce resources, the value of it goes up in our mind. Like buying a home. Isn't it always peculiar that there always seems to be a last-minute bid from somebody else when you're buying a home? Not always a real bid, but this idea of scarcity. I want the home, somebody else wants it, it makes it more attractive to us. The timeshare example too. They've got a whole bunch of people in the room. They tell you how successful they've been in the weeks before selling these timeshares. They're going fast, and everybody else in the room may buy them too. So you may want to act quick because they all may be gone. The cookie jar on the screen. One of the simplest studies of this is a chocolate chip cookie study. Participants in this consumer preference study were given the same chocolate chip cookie, one from a jar that had 2 cookies in it, one from a jar that had 10 cookies in it. And then the participants were asked to rate the cookies. And the one that came from the jar of only 2 said it tasted better, said it would make a better consumer product, and said they expected it would cost more, even though it was the exact same cookie as the one in the jar with 10. Again, we're easily tricked. We got to be careful about the way our minds work. We got to be aware of it. And when it comes to marketing, the worst that's going to happen is we're going to pay too much for a product, or we're going to buy something we don't want. But these weapons of influence come into play in our lives on a lot of other things too. We're easily swayed if we're not paying attention. The most powerful weapon of influence, and the one I really want to focus on for the next few minutes, is social proof. So, laugh tracks on sitcoms on TV. I've always thought they were annoying. I thought it was silly. Why would they play a laugh track? They're easy to spot. Everybody knows it's fake laughter. Why did they think this is going to make me laugh more? Well, because studies show they work. We all know it's fake laughter, but even knowing that doesn't change. Based on these studies, the same show played with a laugh track is rated funnier and more entertaining than the show without a laugh track. Next slide. Same thing in opera. It's more highbrow things too. Back in the 1800s, they started this practice of what's called clacking. They would pay people to react in an opera, to give a standing ovation or applause when people came on or off the stage, or say bravo, or whatever they wanted them to do. In the book, there's a price list of applause and different reactions. The last one I liked was wild enthusiasm, and that was for a price to be arranged later. Another example of social proof is when people, like guitar players out on the street, street performers or a bartender or something, will salt their tip jars, put in a few extra dollars to start with so people see the dollars in there, think, oh, well, this is appropriate to give them some folding money for what they're doing, so I'm going to follow suit and do the same thing. But next slide. Again, these are all fairly innocuous, but as we know from Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. We've got to be careful about how we look at social proof and social evidence, social cues from other people. We are most vulnerable to the influence of others, of social proof, when we're unsure of ourselves, when the situation is unclear or ambiguous, when uncertainty reigns. And in those moments, we're most likely to look around and accept the actions of others for how we're supposed to act. It could be as simple as going somewhere and not knowing where to stand in line. So we get in line with people. If we've never been to a restaurant before, see how people order up at the counter, that kind of thing. And the greater number of people that we see acting a certain way, the more likely we are to follow. So it's not just peer pressure of a group. It's just a natural brain reaction. When we're uncertain, we're going to look and see what other people are doing. But the flaw in the way our brain is wired for this is that other people are doing the same thing. So if nobody knows what to do, we're all looking around at each other and nobody's reacting. And so we think, okay, the proper response is not to react at all, and none of us do anything. Now this can lead to trouble in a couple of ways. Either we follow someone who doesn't know what they're doing, or worse, is intentionally trying to lead us astray, or we see that everybody's ignoring the situation, we choose to ignore it also. One of it's kind of a grisly example, is Jim Jones and the People's Temple in Guyana. Back in the 70s, drinking the Kool-Aid, had this poison drink. Jim Jones was a very dynamic leader that had taken this People's Temple from San Francisco and put them down in Guyana. People in a fact-finding mission down to Guyana were murdered, and Jim Jones believed that he would be implicated in the murder. And so he had decided, instead of having my People's Temple taken down, I'm going to end it the way I want to end it, on my own terms. And he convinced the nearly 1,000 people in his compound to all commit suicide. Now, obviously, he was a very dynamic leader, so there were other weapons of influence at play here, but he gathered the entire community together. He gave them this instruction, and first a young woman went forward, herself and her baby. She drank this strawberry-flavored poison and gave it to her baby. And after that, the theory in this book is that after that, people not knowing what to do, uncertain, in a strange land, they only know the people in the compound, one after the other, they walk down in an orderly fashion, 910 people drink the poison and die. Now, to be sure, not everyone did this. Some resisted, some escaped. And the escapees said it was like the people were hypnotized. They were falling prey, among other things, to social proof. They didn't know what to do. They followed the leader, just like lemmings. Now, a less grisly example is the timeshare. Like I said, a bunch of people in the room, and they make a big deal when somebody signs up for a timeshare. Pop the champagne, bring it out. Alan and Kristen just did this. Hey, everybody, let's applaud Alan and Kristen for buying this. Oh, well, if Alan and Kristen did it, sign me up. They don't look stupid, even though they may be. All right, next slide. So we learn this, and we already know this. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. Social proof can be a useful tool sometimes. It's the reason our brains are wired that way, but it's dangerous. How do we do this? How do we take refuge in the Lord instead of in man? Next slide. How do we walk by faith and not by sight? Next slide. Romans 10:17, so faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Constant study and prayer and contemplation of the word of Christ. We need to rewire our minds. Next slide. Hebrews 2, verse 1, therefore we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. Next slide. John 14:25 and 26. "These things I have spoken to you while I'm still with you, but the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you." We need to listen for the 8:1. Next slide. "Does not wisdom call? Does not understanding raise her voice?" The voice is there to be heard. Let's pay attention. Proverbs chapter 2, verses 1 through 5. "My son, if you receive my words and treasure up my commandments with you, making your ear attentive to wisdom and inclining your ear," that should be ear, not hear, "to understanding. Yes, if you call out for insight and raise your voice for," next slide, "understanding, if you seek it like silver and search for it as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God." We need to know that we're susceptible to these weapons of influence. We need to seek out the will of God and prepare our minds to resist what is nearly an automatic response to certain triggers. As it says in Romans 12, verse 2. Next slide. "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect." We have to remember, our brains just work this way. It seems simple. We're confident that in the heat of the moment we'll be able to say no to these pressures, but the silly example of the timeshare shows that we're susceptible to it. Even when we know going in what they're trying to do, we can fall prey to it unless we renew our mind and by testing try to discern what the will of God is. Another thing we can fall prey to, as I wrap up, next slide, James 4:17. "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin." We need to not just resist going along with the crowd, because sometimes we can look around and ignore a situation that needs attention. There's a phenomenon talked about in this influence book known as pluralistic ignorance. It's what I was talking about. We look around for social cues, nobody's doing anything, and so we ignore the problem. This happens all the time where bystanders pass by, kind of like the Good Samaritan. He actually stopped. But people pass by someone who's in obvious need of help. Now, very often an emergency is not obvious. Is the man lying in the alley a heart attack victim, or is he a drunk that's sleeping one off? Are the sharp sounds from the street, are they gunshots, or did a truck backfire? We don't always know. So we look for social cues, and if people are passing by, not acting, we're more likely to do the same. But sometimes we need to stop and help. And by doing so, we can start a positive chain reaction rather than the negative ones that we've talked about. We can take this weapon of influence, and if we'll step out, next slide, and be the light of the world, others will follow us. Matthew 5, "You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." But sometimes we're still paralyzed by fear or feeling inadequate. We need to remember, again, renew our mind. Next slide, Philippians 4:13. "I can do all things through him who strengthens me." And we don't have to be extraordinary. The Bible is full of ordinary people who are used for extraordinary things. Next slide. We've got Moses, who told the Lord, "I'm not eloquent. I don't know. I'm slow of speech." And the Lord said, "I'll be your mouth." And of course, Aaron helped him too. Let's go forward a few slides to Peter and John. In Acts 4:13, it says, "Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, they perceived that they were uneducated common men. They were astonished, and they recognized that they had been with Jesus." These were uneducated common men. They were fishermen, but they professed the Word of God with boldness. They had confidence in Him, and others followed. Skip forward to Romans 12, 4 through 8. We may also say, "But I don't have the right talents. I can do some things, but I'll let other people handle this." But we all have a job to do. "For as in one body we have many members, and the members do not all have the same function. So we, though many, are one body in Christ, and individually members of one another, having gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. Let us use them." Next slide. Some of you won't like this next slide. What we have to do is just do our job. That's, Nick Saban says that over and over. He's good at repetition, like Brett was saying over and over again. Do your job. He talked about when he worked for Coach Belichick. They had one sign up in there in the office. It was "Do your job." That meant everybody, all personnel, all players, just do your job. Don't worry about the overall picture. You have certain talents, you have a certain position. If you do your job, if you win your individual battle, then the team will win. And that's all we have to do in the kingdom of God. By the grace you're given, just do your job, and the rest will fall into place. And so, next slide. With these weapons of influence, there's a lot more in the book, and I recommend it to you. It's fascinating. The brain is a fascinating thing. But how do we say no? We renew our minds. We get ready. We prepare ourselves, knowing that we can fall prey to these weapons of influence. We study the Word. We stay in prayer. We try to discern the will of God. And then how do we use them? We do our job. We step out first. We don't wait for others. We take that first step, understanding that we can be the first pebble in an avalanche. We just got to do our job, and others will follow. An example of this, and I'll close with this one. I was given this book at a continuing education class a couple of weeks ago, Bus Ride to Justice by Fred Gray. He is a lawyer and preacher out of Montgomery. Actually a preacher in the Church of Christ. Grew up in the Church of Christ in Montgomery. And he was a lawyer for Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. and others in the Civil Rights Movement. And he told a story about the events leading up to Rosa Parks and her decision not to give up her seat on the bus, which of course led to the bus boycott, which gave rise to Martin Luther King Jr., who became the most prominent voice in the Civil Rights Movement. But what many don't know, and what he told us at the luncheon where he spoke, was that 9 months before Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus, a 15-year-old girl named Claudette Colvin, a Montgomery High School student, had done the same thing. She was already at the back of the bus, but was asked to give up her seat. She said no. She was dragged off the bus, and she was arrested. And Fred Gray credits Claudette Colvin's act with giving Rosa Parks the moral courage to do what she did. So we never know what our actions are going to do, what kind of chain reaction it's going to set off. All we need to do is take the first step, and these weapons of influence can work for us and lead others to our cause. And so if we're working for God, we're going to bring others to us just by taking that first step. Thank you very much.